first, even though that's not always necessary these days, I guess. But Lisa Maria Martinez is the Community Services Director at the Lighthouse. She is Vice President of the San Francisco Chapter of the National Federation of the Blind of California and Secretary of the Sports and Recreation Division of the NFB. And she has been an advocate for many, many years. And she has, she's a mother of 3, and of course being blind adds a little, it makes life very interesting when you're dealing with children, and how sometimes people react to you when they see that you are blind and, oh my God, you have kids? Okay, Frank Wellthey is the first Vice President of the California Council of the Blind. He's President of the San Francisco Chapter of the CCB, and he has served several years ago. Was it, Frank, 2007, 2008, was it?
2009 to 2011.
Sorry, okay, I was about here. Okay, doesn't matter. You served for he served for 2 years as the CCB's Director of Advocacy and Governmental Affairs, so he's very well qualified to speak today on both of these people, to speak today on the fundamental rights of blind and visually impaired people. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel. Who's going to start? Frank is going to start.
Good morning, everyone, and I want to thank you all for coming out. We're very pleased at the large turnout we have today. You know, there's a great, wise sage by the name of Woody Allen. He once said 85% of success is just showing up. So that means by walking in the door, if this were a class, you guys all would have already gotten a B. So you're off to a great start.
Oh, B, yay.
So one thing that we're going to do today is that we're going to try not to get too in the weeds, legalistic and all that, but try to make things practical. But I do want to start out with some background. So I'm going to get into some laws. Don't worry, you're not going to be quizzed on this. This is just to give you a sense of what your rights are and where they come from. Okay? You know, of course, there was a time when people with disabilities didn't have a lot of particular legal rights. Everybody assumed we were helpless, useless, you know, and they sort of built the world accordingly, if they thought of us at all. And those of us who had disabilities realized that that wasn't a good situation. So quite a while back now, we started getting ourselves organized in order to speak up and do something about it. And so we've been doing that for many decades now. And the result of that is that life has gotten a whole lot better for people who are blind and with people with other disabilities as well. And so I'm going to talk about some of the things first that we've accomplished, not just blind people, but other people with disabilities and people who understand where we're coming from, to make our society have better opportunities and more equal opportunities for us. So I'm going to go through some of the basic laws that make it possible for us to fight for our rights and to get access to society. The big one is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. And let me tell you what ADA does, in a nutshell. ADA guarantees non-discrimination and reasonable accommodation in employment, state and local government services, public accommodation, transportation, and certain communication services. That's basically, in a nutshell, what ADA does. And now, so keep that in mind. Another important law that may not affect you, because I don't know if we have any kids in the room, but it might affect people you know, perhaps your children, grandchildren, whatever, is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. IDEA guarantees a free, appropriate education for students with disabilities. In other words, that means that students who go to public schools who have disabilities have the right to get accommodations so that they can fulfill their educational potential in the public schools. Another important law is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. This provides for accommodations in federal government programs. That means that that programs have an obligation to make themselves more accessible to people with disabilities. Another related law is Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is actually a big deal because it requires the federal government to use accessible equipment and websites. It's important not only because if you want to get a service, say if you're working for the government, you need to have equipment that you can use to do your job. Also, if you want to get a government service, especially now that so many government services have gone to websites, then they need to be accessible to us so that we get the same services everybody else gets who goes to the websites. And is that the government is just about the biggest customer around. If the government needs something, then the producers out there of those products will modify their products so that the government will buy them. And guess what happens when they do that? That means everybody gets to buy those modified products, right? So even though it's specifically aimed at government, it ends up affecting all of society. Okay, another law that can be important is the Air Carriers Access Act, or ACAA. This law provides for the accessibility of airline travel. And that's important because ADA, which most of us think about when we think of accessibility, actually doesn't cover airline travel because this other law does. So they they're different areas of importance. Another law that most of us may not always think about that has impact for us with disabilities is the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits housing discrimination on the basis of disability and for other groups as well. And of course, because discrimination does happen against those of us who are disability, because of this Housing Rights Act, we also get protected. Another more recent bill that's come along to affect us is the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA. This law promotes the use of accessible voting systems among other reforms, particularly for federal elections. And that means that when you go to a voting station, hopefully, you'll have a voting machine that you can actually use without having somebody look over your shoulder, which is a nice thing when it actually works. Okay, and the last law I'm going to talk about is the Video and Communications Access Act, or VCAA, which requires certain manufacturers and producers of television equipment to make their products accessible and requires certain minimum amounts of audio description services on television. Who likes audio description? Finally, after a big effort and a number of years, that law got passed, and it really, especially in the last year, you're really starting to see it kick in. Like, you're suddenly seeing all of these like Comcast and all these different services suddenly coming out with accessible set-top boxes. Gee, isn't it interesting it happened just this year? Guess why? Because they had to. Yes.
Good answer.
They didn't just do it out of the goodness of their heart.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do all these laws mean for you? First off, I didn't run through them so that I would turn you all into lawyers and make you have to spout legalese, okay? The reason is that they have specific impacts on you. And let me just run through those. In the case of housing, you have the right to equal access to housing without regard to your disability. Another thing, in employment, you may not be discriminated against in employment on the basis of your disability as long as you are qualified and you can perform the essential functions of the job. You have the right to reasonable accommodations not only on the job, but during the job search process. That means getting help filling out the job application. Did you know that? Yeah, now you do. Education. You have the right to receive a free, appropriate K through 12 education and to obtain reasonable accommodation throughout your education. That's important because education is such a powerful element in a successful life, isn't it? Governmental programs. You have the right to receive reasonable accommodation to obtain equal access to governmental services. You know, that means like getting documentation in alternative formats. And sometimes we have to fight with certain entities to get that done, even though they're required. But yes, we do have that right. Public accommodations. That's pretty much, if it's not government, it's a public accommodation. That means you have equal right to access establishments that serve the general public, provided the accommodation required to obtain that right is reasonable, and that it doesn't fundamentally alter the goods or services being provided, and it doesn't impose an undue burden on the provider of the service. Now, what does that mean? First off, it means that the word reasonable accommodation is that, we've met those people who think that because they have a disability that the world owes them everything, right? And they want it, not only does the world owe it everything, but it has to be done exactly their way, right? Otherwise you're discriminating. No, it just means, what it means is that as long as you're getting the access, in other words, like, you go to the restaurant, as long as you're getting served what you want, then the how of it is not as important as that the results happen. For example, that means that a lot of people have probably believed that the ADA requires Braille menus, right? Wrong. It requires accommodation. So if you go to a restaurant and the wait staff is really, really good about actually reading the whole menu to you, if you want, that's accommodation. Yeah. Now, we know in practice that usually it makes more sense to have a Braille menu. It's easier for us and it's easier for the staff, but still, as long as they're working with you to do the accommodation, and that's true in all of these situations, whether it's, whether it's restaurants, hotels, stores, whatever, as if the people are working in a reasonable way to make the accommodation work for you, then there's more than one way to skin a cat. And that's important to realize.
Excuse me.
Except that we don't go around skinning cats. I'll have to work on my metaphors here, won't I? Okay.
Like a bird? I don't know.
We'll
I
figure
like
that
birds.
out. Okay. I won't be mean to animals, don't worry. But another thing that's important, and that you don't hear as much, is that there's a term of that the accommodation doesn't fundamentally alter the goods or services. And that means that, for example, basically that if what you want done means like totally redoing the whole thing, like from the ground up, that's not going to happen. It's one thing that if you want to get tactile markings on a stove, it's another thing if you want a completely redesigned stove, right? Something like that, And another thing that's important about that is that when they talk about the accommodation imposing an undue burden, one accommodation might be appropriate for a big company, but not for a small business. If you are going to a big, if you're going to Walmart, right, you can expect quite a bit of accommodation. The automatic doors, the ramps, accessible point of sale terminals so you can put in your debit card pin without having to tell the clerk what it is, all that stuff. But if you're talking about, Bob and Sue who are running a little hot dog stand, and they're just kind of scraping by, from month to month to pay the rent and keep, food on the table, then guess what? If you ask them to put in a $50,000 modification to their building, which they don't even own, by the way, ain't going to happen because that's not reasonable. It would be an undue burden for them. So that makes a difference. Okay, I've talked enough about that for now. Transportation. You generally have the right to receive accommodation to access transportation services, but the level of required accommodation varies depending on which laws or regulations govern the specific type of service. For example, I talked about how the Air Carriers Access Act covers airplane travel, whereas say that the other stuff is covered by ADA. So they have slightly different rules. The general principle is the same, but depending on the accommodation and which law covers it, that can be different. Voting. You have the right to vote independently in federal elections. Rules vary for state and local elections. It's not as clear that those same laws apply to state and local elections as the federal election, Personally, I think that if a county has to get the voting equipment for the federal elections, they might as well use it in all the elections, right? But anyway, just be aware that it's mainly, the main impact is federal. So sometimes, like if you're talking about your local school board election, it may be harder to make the accommodation because the law isn't as clear about that. Television. Manufacturers, and that's pretty important, isn't it? Manufacturers and producers need to provide accessible television equipment, and providers must provide at least a minimum, and I do mean minimum, level of hours of audio description programming per calendar quarter. Who here does audio description?
I do.
I know.
I use Amazon Fire TV.
Well, hopefully when more of these accessible TVs start getting out into the public, more of us will be able to access it, because I know up to now it's been a real pain in the neck, hasn't it?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So what's the bottom line with all this? And the bottom line is this. Because of different laws that govern different aspects of accommodation and access, the specific legal requirements vary depending on the situation. In general, disability discrimination is illegal, and there must be reasonable accommodation. And the reason I want you to hear that is because what's important to realize is that bottom line is that you and I, in this society at least, have the right to expect that we're going to be included. And at the same time, we have the responsibility to use common sense in terms of what our expectations are. Because again, we're not going to get a Cadillac if a Hyundai will do, right? Yeah. But the point is that we do have to get the thing so that we can actually have access. Now let's talk about some of the strategies, and I'm going to have Lisa Maria pick that up and talk about the how of actually being able to take advantage of the rights that we have. And we're going to spend the rest of the day talking about the how and not being stuck in this legal stuff, okay? Pardon? We will do that. Would you like to take a few questions right now about laws and stuff? Sure, that's good. Let's do it.
Aww.
Well, thanks, Dirk. Coming from you, that's a big compliment. Because Dirk is a sharp guy. He's one of the best advocates I know about around, and Dirk, I appreciate that. And I guess that means I can still learn stuff, huh?
If you could just wait for a second. The microphone's coming over, and then you can speak into the microphone.
Yeah, and Dirk, I did hear your question. What rights do you have in terms of air transportation? And again, we do.
Hi,
yeah.
Frank. The
There you are.
question is, what rights do blind people have in relation to air transportation? If I call on the phone to make a reservation, can I demand access to the cheaper price that would be prevailing online?
Oh, yeah, that is.
That's really tricky right now, and because we've had some court cases where we've tried to get that nailed down in terms of requiring the airlines to make their websites fully accessible, and to require that their ticketing kiosks be accessible. And so far, it's turned out that the regulations in the Air Carriers Access Act and those kinds of things are weaker than for ADA. So the airlines have been able to weasel out of these things in terms of legal requirement by saying that the Air Carrier Access applies, so when we sue them under ADA, it somehow wasn't applicable. I don't know if anybody has actually brought a suit under Air Carriers Access Act to push the limit of what that itself actually requires. So far, they've sort of gotten around it by saying that we were suing them under the wrong law, and therefore they didn't have to address the issues. So I think that it's still up in the air exactly what they're legally required to do. I mean, so that's a tough one. Some airlines have been better than others about honoring the fact that and recognizing that their websites aren't fully accessible, and so they've extended those website discounts to people with disabilities who call the particular phone number. But it's been sort of, it hasn't really been a legally binding thing, so it's still a bit iffy at this point. I think it's an area that will require continuing advocacy.
Hello, my name is Mike, and
I
I'm going
want-
to be the runner.
Yeah, I want to finish up with just a couple of
Oh, sorry,
things.
go ahead.
Is that a couple of things you want to know too? Is that a big issue, two big issues to be aware of is that one, on the positive side, is that every airline is required to have what's called I think it's called a Complaint Resolutions Officer, or a CRO, at the airport, who's supposed to be somebody who's familiar with the law, so that if you are having a problem in terms of accommodation, that you can, if the people that you're dealing with are just not being helpful, that you have the legal right to request to get in touch with the Complaint Resolution Officer in order to sort of get some help. There have been some good stories about that. There have been some bad stories where, like, there was one case this last year where a blind woman was basically hauled off of an airplane with her guide dog, and the CRO was a big jerk about the whole thing.
Yeah.
But in principle, at least, they should have somebody that if you get into a situation where, you know, for example, you're being denied the right to take your guide dog on the plane, or they're doing some other unreasonable things in terms of your disability, that there should be somebody available at the airport that you can call upon to help resolve this situation. Most people don't know that, and I think more people should. And the one a negative thing, aside from the fact that we've already discussed how their regulations seem to be a little weaker so far, is that the Air Carriers Access Act currently has a much broader definition of what animals are allowed on the plane. You know, the AADA has a very specific definition of a service animal, which we in the blind community like, because it says the dog must be a dog, first of all, not a chicken or something. Hey, believe me, they've tried.
Yep, they have.
It must be individually trained to provide a service that compensates for a person's disability. So-called comfort animals are not service animals under ADA. Now, I should mention that the Fair Housing Act actually says that comfort animals, even though they're not service animals, are accommodated under the Fair Housing. So that means that a person who has a comfort animal that needs it for their disability in their home can have that animal, which at home is kind of reasonable. You know, like if you've got a psychological issue and your pet helps you feel better, I don't think it's unreasonable that you should be able to take that pet in your home, even if it's a place that normally doesn't allow pets. I think that's reasonable. As opposed to out in the public, where when we're out in the public, we really should have some minimum qualifications for our service animals, that they're actually trained so that they're not just running wild in public, right?
Service rooster.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the Air Carriers Access Act currently has the looser standards, so that people are able to get away with bringing their comfort monkeys or whatever onto the plane. And it's kind of a problem at this point. And our advocates are trying to work to improve that situation, and they're getting pushback from the people on the other side who want to be able to bring Fifi on the plane. And
Aw,
so
poor Fifi.
it hasn't been resolved. I think hopefully in the long term we'll get regulations in terms of air travel and animals that are more in line with ADA, which I personally think are more sensible. We'll see. But I hope that answers your question about air travel. Okay, and Mike, was it, who had another question?
I was going to say, if anybody has a question, raise your hand and I'll run to get you the mic, but give me a few seconds to get that.
We need to move on to Lisa Maria.
Okay, great. And
Please
there will
do.
be plenty of time later for more questions. So, okay.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Lisa Maria. Many of you know me as LM. Wow, okay, so I'm after Frank, and he just gave a really great presentation. So I'm going to be talking to you all this morning a little bit on strategies and some do's and don'ts when you are out there advocating for yourself or on behalf of other people. I think the most common strategy that most of us use is an informal negotiation, talking things through with the other party. So I feel like I do this every day of my life. Well, maybe not every day. So this means you encounter something that might not be accessible, and you approach the folks who are providing this service or providing the technology or something, and you have a conversation with them about the inaccessibility of their product. A really good example of this, I think, is I pay for a service called Stitch Fix. I don't know if anyone out there knows what Stitch Fix is, but basically it's a personal stylist. And I took a style quiz, and every so often I get 5 items of clothing and or accessories that have been personally chosen based off of my style or the style that I want to have. And it's really exciting every month to get a box. It's like Christmas, to open up clothes and see what's new and exciting. And there's a bunch of paper that comes in that box. It's my stylist, writes a personalized note for me. There's a card in there saying, this is how you can pair your clothing, and it's all in print. Well, print doesn't work so good for me. So I figured I am paying, money to buy these clothes, and for this service, I'm going to contact their customer service and say, I'm blind. Could you possibly email me what my stylist is telling me in print? And email me the styling notes on, how to pair everything. They were really great about it, and every time I get a fix, I also get an email, and it's really cool. And so Stitch Fix has accommodated me that way. That was a very informal way. Other blind people I know are now using Stitch Fix or going back to Stitch Fix because they didn't ask for this accommodation. And so they felt at a disadvantage because they didn't know how to pair their clothes or whatever, was said in the printed materials. So now they're going back to Stitch Fix and saying, hey, I'm blind. I have a friend who did this and I want it now too. So Stitch Fix has been really cool about that, and I'm really excited that more and more people are choosing to go that route, and they never pushed back on it. So that's one example of informally talking things through with another party. Another example is the Fremont Unified School District, where my son is a first grader right now. And when he started school, and we did this in preschool, and we did this in his first preschool and his second preschool, which was at a Montessori, I had a conversation with his teachers about emailing the monthly newsletter, or emailing any homework assignments, or emailing any kind of handouts or flyers. And that's a mixed bag. The school district sends out a lot of flyers through a third-party service that they use, not accessible. Embedded images in the email, and so the text is, they take a picture of the text and they put that picture in the email so they can put 5 flyers at the same time in an email. That's not accessible, and I'm trying to work with the school district to change that, but that will be an uphill battle. The PTA was really responsive, and they're like, oh, we won't take pictures anymore of text. We'll write it in, So the PTA has been really good. The kindergarten teacher last year tried really hard to scan the homework and send it to me, but then I found out the reason it was all gobbledygook was because it was all handwritten. So I said, oh, don't bother scanning anymore because it's all handwritten. It's not going to work out anyways. But she was really excited to try to help. So if there was ever anything that she sent me that was important, and his first grade teacher agreed to this too, if we're going to send home a letter, we're going to call you and tell you the contents of the letter. So last Monday, I got a call from the teacher, and I'm like, oh no, he's in trouble. She said, no, I'm calling to tell you he got selected for Student of the Month. And I was like, well, that's awesome. So, these conversations conversations are really important to have, and you know, I'm giving examples of talking to teachers in schools, but you could think about having these conversations with any of the things that you might be involved with if you're doing volunteer jobs, you know, at an organization or your job even, your church. I mean, there's all kinds of places that, you know, most likely they're going to try really darn hard to accommodate you. And then there's going to be times where people will say, no way, we're not going to try. And so then you might want to take a little bit more action or be a little more assertive in your approach. And you might want to reach out to some of the resources that Frank and I will talk about later. So a stronger approach might be something like structured negotiation, and this usually involves a lawyer to help work out an agreement with the other parties. So I'm thinking of an example that I was involved with concerning Kaiser here in Oakland. When I had my first kid in 2011, but prior to that, I was having a lot of issues with Kaiser, having me fill out a lot of paperwork. The medical assistants were not very assisting, and when they were to fill out the paperwork, they wanted to do it in the middle of the waiting room, where, you know, there's a lot of confidential information being said. They gave me a lot of booklets and pamphlets on, you know, being a first-time parent and how to, you know, how to raise a newborn and diaper them and breastfeeding and all these things. And it was all in print. And the Preparing for Childbirth book was 70-something pages long. And when I asked this was a class I was taking, I asked the instructor, do you know if this is in an alternative format? And she goes, well, I think they have it in Spanish. So I said, I'm really glad it's in Spanish, and I hope it's in other languages as well, but I mean alternative formats like audio or Braille or even large print, which wouldn't help me, but maybe it would help someone else. So I had to do a lot of research and talk to a bajillion people to try to see how to get the documents in an accessible format. And I started talking to some of my friends, as I do when I am stuck and I'm facing issues like this. And I heard that disability rights advocates were looking for people who were having problems with Kaiser. And so I called them and I started sharing my stories with them and documenting all of the all of the interactions I was having with Kaiser, and then sharing that documentation with the lawyers at DRA. And it took 5 years, and a lot of structured negotiation with the lawyers and a lot of back and forth with Kaiser. But now Kaiser is doing a better job at providing alternative formats. And oh, by the way, I did get an electronic copy of that 70-something page booklet the day I went into labor. So I didn't see it until about 3 weeks later when I turned on my computer for the first time. But I did get it. So Kaiser has done a lot more now to be a lot more friendlier with screen readers on their website, and now I get questionnaires from my pediatrician, the ones that I get at the visit. In print, I can now, it comes to me automatically via email, and I can go fill it out and then print it and bring it so that I don't have to ask a medical assistant to fill it out with me. So that is structured negotiation. There were lawyers involved, a lot of sit-down conversations, a lot of back and forth, and it took a long time. Eventually things got done, and by all means, Kaiser may not be perfect, but at least they're trying. And so that was the result of several individuals and the California Council of the Blind, who is the organizational party to those structured negotiations. Sometimes you need to bring in more than a lawyer to help come to a compromise, and so you might have to mediate and some kind of agreement between the two parties. And I've had experience with mediation in a lawsuit with Redbox, and which is a company that has kiosks that look like really big vending machines, but they spit out DVDs. And as a blind person and many low vision people, it's really hard to access the DVDs to rent, and then to even return it can be really difficult. So mediation was really interesting. We had to bring in someone who was a professional mediator, and there was it was several days, not all together, but there's several rounds of mediations that go on, and each round can last an entire day, and the mediator will sit with one party, say the blind folks, and talk to them about one aspect. Like for instance, you might want to say, well, we want speech so we can access the screen. And so the mediator might go back to the other party and say, they want speech, how can you accommodate them? And they might say, never! We don't want to do speech. That's an unreasonable accommodation, and we think that's an undue hardship to us, and we propose something else, or we insist on a secondary, solution. So there's a lot of back and forth, and it can get really tense sometimes. So that's mediation, and then sometimes you just have to sue the pants off of a company to get something accomplished. And I believe an ongoing lawsuit that many of us in the community know about is Uber, and how they are with guide dog users, and how unfriendly they've been with guide dogs in their cars. So those are some examples of talking things through with people, for informally and formally. You don't have to go sue someone, but sometimes you have to. I think you'll find that in many cases in your day-to-day life, it's simply talking to someone and asking them to tweak something here and there to make it just a little bit more accessible and friendly to everyone. And you might know that something could be more accessible, but you might not know how it could be more accessible. That's when I start calling my blind friends and saying, hey, how do we work this out? Or calling up organizations and saying, this is going on, how can you help me? Or can you direct me to a resource? And again, Frank and I can talk through some resources later. And before I wrap up my part, just a couple of do's and don'ts. In terms of do's, you really want to try to have a good working knowledge of your legal rights. And like I said, you might not know everything, but you could do a little research, or someone else might know something. You want to, earlier I mentioned that when working on the Kaiser case, I documented every interaction I had. That's really important. Because that's something that you can use later on down the road, especially if it does take years to accomplish your original goal. You might not remember, what your interaction was from 3 years ago. So when you document things, that really helps keep track of all the important details. You always want to be firm, but be polite. Sometimes that can be really hard to do, but it's really important to always be very civilized and professional when talking to people, especially when they're getting really upset, because sometimes when you ask them to change something about their service or the product that they're providing, it can get a little personal, So if you could keep it professional it's likely they're going to be professional on the other side. You don't want to go in there screaming your head off and saying, you're breaking the law. So, be flexible. As Frank said earlier, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And maybe what you think is an appropriate accommodation, you might end up compromising on something that does accommodate folks, but maybe isn't the way you originally imagined it. Never be rude or nasty. That's not going to get you anywhere. Whatever you do, don't give up. Don't give up, because it might be a rocky road to get to what you're trying to accomplish, but you're smoothing the path for other people down the road, so that they don't have to deal with this as well. So it can be tough, but don't give up.
Sounds like a good time for more questions.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, who's got a question?
Mike, are you available?
So raise your hand if you'd like to ask a
We
question.
have a runner, so.
Mike's got the mic.
Got the mic. Okay, wait, oh boy. Okay, I'll get each one I see first.
Hello, this is Theodora McBride. I want to know, how can you help someone that the parents and everyone put them in a nursing home because they went totally blind? The man, he don't know how to do anything for himself. And I just need to know, is it anyone that can help him? He's about 43 years old, but he just sits all day. He don't know anything to do for himself, plus speak or anything.
I can actually take the mic off the thing so we can pass it back and forth. Yeah, that makes me really sad to hear that, because at 43, I hope to not be stuck in a nursing home.
Hey, at 56, I hope that.
And, if the only reason is blindness, there are definitely things that I think can work out to be beneficial for the gentleman you're talking about. I work at the Lighthouse, and there are several individuals at the Lighthouse who can come and work with the individual, or at least get him coming out of the nursing home and learning skills so that he's not just sitting there. Usually it will have to involve a social worker or a case manager, probably between the nursing home and we have a social worker at the Lighthouse who probably would be the one to initiate consulting and eventually providing the services. But if blindness is the only reason, there's first a lot of education that needs to happen, both to the family and to the gentleman, because I don't, without knowing all the details, it's hard to say whether or not, did the family put him in there, and do they have, what is the word, not power of attorney, but sort of like that, guardianship.
Guardianship.
Yeah, guardianship of him.
Yeah.
Because if they do, then that's going to be trickier and a lot of education to the families. So it's really hard to answer your question, but I think the best thing to do is to start educating all the parties involved and maybe talking with the gentleman and telling him, hey, is this what you really want? No? Great, let's do something about it. And if you call up the Lighthouse, we can try to get some of our social workers and teachers involved in hopefully providing him services.
Oh, she got your hand. Somebody raise their hand?
Good morning. My name is Maria Piper, and I am a president of the Lion Center in Pittsburgh. Wednesdays. And we have a problem because they pick us up late, all the time. Well, we can count with the hand the day that come on time. But most of the time, they come late. Last Tuesday, it was the worst. Make us wait 2 hours.
And that's,
And I said a complaint. But what they're going to do, they send me a letter, they send me a ticket for the bus, and that's it. And we are really mad because it happens all the time. And it's not just me, it's a lot of people who come in the bus. And people who come from Concord, and people who come from other cities. And how I can do a formal complaint against Dial Right. I mean, Dial Right is the paratransit there.
well, you know, a lot of people don't want to do it, but a lot of these organizations like paratransit providers or other kind of institutional providers are really what we call data-driven. In other words, they're keeping statistics on customer complaints, and so management sees those statistics, and based on what the statistics are telling them, then they make decisions about where they need to put in resources. Like, you know, we're getting a lot of statistics, vehicles are breaking down, then they're going to put more money into the mechanics, right? If they're getting more reports about people getting late rides, then they're going to be aware, oh, that's where we have to prioritize right now. It's not so much the mechanical stuff, it's maybe our scheduling or whatever it is. But if people don't complain, then management here, right? So the very first thing, and when I say complain, I don't mean scream, I just mean report. You know, so if there's a problem, you know, report. Usually that means you can call in to your provider, and they should have a way you can call in a report of a problem and give them the information, and get as many people as you can do that, because that's another thing where they're driven by numbers. So if you're the only one who gets off the couch and calls in a complaint, then maybe that goes on radar. But if 75 people every week are calling them, complaining about being stranded, being late, rude drivers, whatever it is, then it gets onto their statistical reports, and management sees that and says, okay, we got a problem, what are we going to do? That's the first thing. The second thing is that if you do that and just do a standard complaint, isn't getting you anywhere, it's just kind of, you call in, you give the report, all your friends are calling in, they're giving their reports, and just nothing's changing. I think the thing to do there is to arrange a meeting with somebody who is a manager at the agency. And I would say that that's where being part of a group helps, because if you're there with a group, whether it's you're representing a group that you're involved with, or you just get a group of people to go down there, so it's not just one person, and having a full meeting where you're talking to them and saying, we've been sending in complaints, we're not seeing changes, what can we do? And actually get a face-to-face conversation with somebody who has some authority. And you may have to, in order to get to that person, you may have to do some phone calls and ask some questions like who's in charge of the customer complaint department, or whatever they call it in that agency. And you may have to do some digging to find the right person to talk to. Then that would be the next step. And if that doesn't work, you know, you've done your individual communication with an organization and it's not getting better, I think that's when we start getting into these other processes like the structured negotiation and the arbitration. And what I would suggest then is that you get in touch with one of the organizations that's in that great resource list that David put together, and get somebody like either an advocate at your local independent living center, or perhaps a lawyer who does disability rights law, to get them involved to help you in terms of doing that advocacy, because they're very experienced, and whereas you just as an individual may not get attention, lawyers know how to write letters that get attention, right? And so, and that can help. And so that's the process, I'd say. I mean, definitely, I just hope that you will do that, because all around the Bay Area, some paratransit providers are better than others, but most of them have room for improvement, and the way to do it is just to keep knocking on the door.
Any other questions? Oh, here we go.
Thank you. I have a question.
Hi, this is Dorothy. This is regarding paratransit as well. And I suppose what you just said would work for paratransit who cannot, or say they cannot accommodate people in certain hours. Or, in my case, on the weekend, I cannot get paratransit. Or after a certain hour of the day, I can't get paratransit. Or in midday, at one point, we couldn't get it until they did put in a shuttle bus. So I suppose then this would be one that you would get a lawyer.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a piece that I forgot to mention, and that is, specifically with paratransit, is that paratransit providers usually have a couple of organized groups that you can appeal to. One is that they usually have some kind of a consumer advisory committee, and they call it different names depending on which provider you're with. So they have regular meetings where you can raise issues, and maybe even if you're so inclined, arrange to become a member of the advisory committee, where you have a chance to get your complaints to management. And another thing that you can do is that not only do they have consumer advisory committees, but they also have boards of directors that have regular meetings. And you can actually go to one of their board meetings, and during the public comment period, get up. And with your 2 minutes that they give you, you can tell them that, I'm having a problem that I have needs to be at places at certain times, and you're not providing service at those times or to those places, and that's hurting me. And if you and your friends will go to those meetings, and again, if they hear 5 or 10 people every month, they know they're going to hear from the folks who are not getting their service. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. So but there is one thing to be aware of, specifically with paratransit, is that paratransit is unfortunately not a complete door-to-door transportation service. Its intent is to follow bus routes. Because the reason we even have paratransit is that back in the early days of disability rights, when everybody was clamoring for wheelchair-accessible buses, the providers were saying, hey, that's expensive to put wheelchair lifts on every single bus. And so what they did was they came up with a compromise. They said, okay, we'll get this additional service so that the people who need wheelchair lifts can get special vans to take them where they want to go. But it's going to be the same level as you would get with a bus. So like if you have buses going from point A to point B but not to point C, we're not going to go to point C either. So what it means is that they actually are not legally required to go everywhere, only to the places where buses go, and within like I think it's 3/4 of a mile, I think it is, of the bus route. So that can be a problem, and some agencies take a broader view of that and really try to do as much as they can, and other agencies try to do only what they have to. And unfortunately, the law is such that those agencies that only want to do what they have to can get away with that.
Well, that's my case, because they say that I have to be within 3/4 of a mile.
Exactly.
And I am not.
And unfortunately, with the law at this point, that's kind of the reality.
Now, I had,
Okay,
I had another question.
I'll take one more question, then we're going to do a role play.
Okay, this was regarding the Kaiser thing. I recently joined a healthy weight loss class and was given a book. And I'm thinking, okay, it's all printed and I can read it with my scanner. Well, I get it at home, reading it with the scanner, but then there are the forms there. So I can't do anything with those forms. I can't fill out anything. So now I want to participate in the class, and I'm really trying to figure out how can I make my own thing up to do it. But now I'm hearing that maybe I could go and request that they maybe give it to me in an electronic form.
I would start by asking the instructor or the doctor who, I don't know, not all classes have to be a referral, some are self-referral, but you might want to just talk to your regular general practitioner. They might know who specifically to contact. There is a health and education department at Kaiser, and they're the ones who have a lot of the materials. And you might want to check in with them. One thing I have learned is a lot of what they give you in print is available on kp.org. And so you might want to check there. But I would first go to the instructor of the class or your general practitioner and say, I would like this book in an alternative format. And if they can't direct you, then you might want to go to the Health and Education. I don't think that's exactly their name, but it's something like that, Health and Education Department. And you could start talking to them and say, I know you have to provide this to me accessibly. So, yeah, they might say this is all on kp.org. So I know that kp.org has podcasts on weight loss and a whole bunch of other stuff. And some of that might be part, the same information might be in the book. I don't know. So, but that's where I would start if I were you.
Thank you very much.
So now to role playing.
Okay, I do. Okay, and now we're going to get everybody involved here.
Woo!
And so we're going to do some role playing. And so I'm going to raise an issue, and I'm going to ask for somebody who may have recently or in the past encountered, or maybe you're currently encountering a specific issue that we want to hear about. Okay, the first one is you're seeking an accommodation from a local business. Can one of you give me an example where perhaps you have or are currently dealing with something where you need an accommodation from a local business? Because we all encounter those every day, don't we? Is there somebody raising a hand? Okay, I think I hear somebody.
Do you want to do the business with the client? You could deny them.
One thing
And Ellen will be the advocate.
businesses which sell products, I would like to know when you have a recorded or braille or some media that I can use to search your products and pick them out and order them.
So let me see if I get this right. Is that you want to be able to find where you can get information about products so you can research them and order them?
This particular company, it sells products for the blind. Radios and recorders and all kinds of things.
Right, electronic.
I want you to be able to see what products you have and how much they cost and what they're like. If you have a recorded version of your sales catalog.
Okay, so that's the question, and I'm going to play the role here of the business, and so why don't you pretend that you're calling me on the phone, and I'm Frank from Business X, and just go ahead and pretend that you're talking to me on the phone. So, ring ring, hello, this is Frank at Business X. How can I help you today?
Good evening, Frank. I really like your products. People have described it to me. But I would like to know if you have a description or a type of catalog, recorded or braille, that I could browse your items.
Oh my, that's a great question. Well, sir, I want you to know that we have a beautiful large print catalog for people like you, and we'd be happy to send that to you. Isn't that wonderful?
That would really help. Thank you very much.
No.
You're getting a bunch of no's. Well, I want to, you know, for some folks, that'd be fine.
Yep.
True.
And if you're a large print reader, and the person offers you a large print catalog, for you, that's a reasonable accommodation.
He said braille.
So you're not
He
a
said
large
braille.
print reader. And so now what do? So I've just told you, I've got this lovely large print catalog, aren't I wonderful? So how do you want to respond to that?
Larry?
Oh, did we lose Larry?
All right.
Because I'm getting that you probably need something other than a large print catalog, right?
Yes.
It would be really nice sometimes my scanner won't work, and there aren't people. Sometimes reading print is not as easy as other times. If it was more flexible, if it was recorded, for example, a tape or digital, is there anything like that possibly you could provide to me or tell me how to get?
Okay, that's good. That's good. Now, if I were being a jerk, I'd probably say, well, no, we can't do that. And,
You got those too, huh?
yeah,
Yep.
but what it actually though, and let me tell you what you can do in those situations is that, and this is where it can help if you have a little bit of extra knowledge, is that sometimes all they really need to know is to know how they can do it. So for example, it may help for you to be aware of, to have some ideas of alternatives. Like, for example, if you're a computer user and if you have email, then you might just ask them if they can send an electronic version of the document, like a Word version, because presumably these days, most every document originates in an electronic format. There aren't too many people composing documents on typewriters anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So, presumably, they probably have a copy of the original document. If they prepared the document themselves, then they've certainly got a copy of that document on their computer that they can email you.
Yeah,
or perhaps they might be able to get a copy from the manufacturer. If it's like a company that sells electronics, for example, maybe the manufacturer has a copy of that document, or maybe they can help you get in touch with the manufacturer of that document. So that might be another way to go. Another thing you might want to keep in mind is that you might want to learn about some of the resources that are available for producing documents in other formats. And you might be able to tell them, listen, I know of a certain organization that will produce a document in an alternative format. I happen to work for one, by the way. The Lighthouse does that, by the way.
Yeah.
So that might be some ways that you could approach that situation, is that giving them a suggestion of some specific alternatives that they might want to try that they could probably do, and providing them with one or two resources that they might look to find that accommodation, because sure, that's not their expertise perhaps. Now, you would think that an organization that serves the blind would be a little better about that, but some are, some aren't. But anyway, so that might be some things you can try. Okay.
I got another one.
Okay, I've got another person. Okay.
Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. I have had difficulties when I wanted to get a form filled out when I went to Lake Merritt, to get my paper card renewed.
Yeah.
And then now that I'm a senior, but I have a senior ID, which is different from the California ID. Had to go to motor vehicles, and a person who was waiting in line filled up my form for me because the person behind the counter refused to fill it. And I said, well, I had to take paratransit there, and I'm going to have to take paratransit back home, and all for nothing.
Right.
And a kind-hearted lady helped me, but she didn't work. And
Let's do DMV scenario. Where you got paperwork.
Can you really surly?
Oh, yes.
I can hand this mic back to you.
Ma'am, I step up to the counter, please. What are you here for?
I'm senior ID, and I need somebody to fill out the form so that I can get one because my old ID has expired.
All right. Can your aide help you?
I didn't have an aide, I don't have an attendant, and I came by paratransit and will go home by that way.
Okay.
And I need it, get it done right here.
Okay. Well, you need the paperwork filled out.
That's why I'm asking you.
I do that. I lose my job.
That I haven't heard. They told me they were really, really busy, and there were lots of people around.
Well, when you have to fill out paperwork, maybe you should have someone at home help you. All right, we'll stop there.
That's what they do.
So, I happen to have some knowledge because I have done research, at least with the DMV, and you may want to use this tactic at other places where you do have to fill out paperwork, and they say they can't help you fill it out. If it is the state government, they actually are not supposed to fill out anything on a form for anybody. Now, the reason behind it, so hold on, the reason behind it is in the past, especially with the DMV, workers behind the counter have changed information. Someone filled out a form incorrectly, and they're like, oh, you got this wrong here, let me just fix it. And they also got it wrong, and then the client blamed the DMV and said, you had bad workers, they did this wrong, it's your fault, not mine. And so the DMV has gotten in trouble. Now, what you need to say as a person with a disability is, I need your assistance to fill out this paperwork because I am blind and this is my accommodation. You have to throw that word accommodation out there because the worker isn't necessarily going to know that. So not everyone at the DMV knows, right? They're just going to say, I can lose my job because they can. So my dad happened to be a manager of a DMV office for many, many years down in Southern California. And so, I talked to him, and we have a really good family friend who works all over the state for the DMV. And, they both said, yes, they're not allowed to fill out the forms because they can lose their job if they fill out something incorrectly. But it's a reasonable accommodation, and you have to say that. I need this accommodation, which is for you to help me fill out the paperwork. And if they don't understand that, or if they're still refusing, then you immediately ask for the manager. And the manager of that office should know that, that they can assist by filling out paperwork, because this is an accommodation for someone with a disability. So, don't get angry with someone who already hates their job. Do understand that they technically are not allowed to do this because, they are told not to. But when you say reasonable accommodation, that's supposed to be the magical key that opens the door to this accommodation. So that might be the case in other locations. I don't know, but you might just throw out the word, hey, you need to accommodate me, I can't see, I'm asking you to help me, please. So, good job.
Yeah, that was very good. both of you. That
Yeah.
was very done.
I have another.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, my name is Luther.
Hey, Luther.
I like to wear tennis shoes.
Uh-huh.
So, I go to Nike Outlet a lot.
Yeah.
There's no, sometimes the people, they be really busy. So I was wondering, like, there's no one to describe the shoe to me. So is there a way that they can have somewhere, some kind of machine and some kind of way, a device to describe the shoe to me?
Oh.
Okay, that's a good one. You know, you've got an issue, you want to be able to access shoes, and so what can be done? And I think that part of this is where the flexibility can come in sometimes. And I'll just, a lot of times, you know how it is in retail. Sometimes they get really busy, and sometimes they're not busy.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the flexibility comes in where, even though technically you and I have the right, whenever we go into a store, to get accommodated. That's our legal right, right?
Yep.
Okay. But it may be that there are practicalities where, you know, when people are very busy, clearly they've got a lot to do. So it's a challenge where if you find times when they're not so busy, then things work better. Like when I was single and I was doing my own grocery shopping back before I got married and my wife took that job on. I probably should do more of it. Anyway, but I used to go to the market that was a few blocks away from my house, like first thing Saturday morning. I'd get up early. I happen to be a morning person, that's not so bad. Or I'd do it late in the evening when they weren't crowded. And that worked out really well for me because, it wasn't the crowded time of the day. There weren't like 100 people in the store. There might only been 5 in there, at the time. And so they had people who could help me do the shopping. And I was a regular, so like every week or two I was there, so they were used to me, and it just worked out well. And it might be, part of that might be just finding, if you want to, if this is an ongoing issue for you and you're going to want to do this regularly, is to kind of find that accommodation where you find a time that's good for both you and the people at the store and get to know them. And then I think you'll find that you'll get better accommodation in terms of accessing, getting information about the shoes, having somebody show you the shoes, tell you about the shoes, and help you pick out the shoes depending on the times you go there. But it does. But on the other hand, if you're finding, I think that if you talk to other people who are having the same problems, where everybody is having problems, or lots of people are having problems getting information about shoes, then it may be that you want to do then is actually talk to the company and point out, blind people buy your shoes too. And you put out information because you want people to know about your shoes, but is it in a format that blind people can use too? And what can we do about that? And that's probably something where at that level, that's where you actually want to talk to their corporation or the company to see about a solution, because that's something where the individual store people may not be able, they're not in a position to produce accessible copies of documents or update the company website. So that may be a matter of getting, and you might just ask the store manager if they could give you a contact at corporate to help you find some other solutions.
Okay, thank you.
I have
You got another one?
Yeah.
Okay.
A couple more.
Okay.
I'm trying to keep them in order when I see them. So.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike. This is Ray Marcus.
Hey, Ray.
And, there's usually a store that I usually go to with my sighted brother, but sometimes he can't, and I'll just walk over. But what I do a couple times, I'll call a day or two before, speak to the manager, and then I ask for what employees might be working that day, and he'll say this is a good time, or that's a good time. So it turns out the day before my brother's birthday, since he couldn't come with me, since I was shopping for my brother for his birthday, spoke to the manager, and the manager gave me 3 names, so when I went in, I told him who I was, and he said, oh, the manager's not busy right now, and he spoke with you, and he spoke with us, so he'll be happy to help you. So I actually have the manager help me himself. But it's just good sometimes to call a day or two before to let them know that you are going to be there that day. So just want to share that.
That is an excellent suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, another one. Okay. Steve, I hope you know how to use it.
Well, I was.
Hey, Steve.
Hello, Frank. Lisa, I may have spoken with you over the phone regarding Kaiser and accessible format and receiving medication. And when I was in Alameda, I had no trouble at all getting talking pill bottles, and now the script, I forget what it's called now.
The script talk, yeah.
Script talk. And when I moved in with my brother in Victorville, and I went there for an appointment. Well, we don't do that here, and can't you have someone else read that to you?
Yeah,
and I really got the cold shoulder. And they would do things like, they would take the old pill bottle talker and stick it onto a new updated medication, which meant that I had the wrong date, the wrong doctor.
Oh boy.
Yeah. And so finally, when I was given a prescription, and I called mail order, and I just happened to get in contact with someone who knew what I was talking about, and I think they contacted Victorville's pharmacy, the head person in charge, and I finally got script talk. But at first I had this feeling of being just totally shut out, it was a success story, but I don't know. I just happened to talk to someone who knew about it. I don't know what to recommend as far as if someone else were to face a similar situation.
Well, Steve, I think that your experience actually is very instructive because of the things you did right.
Yep.
The biggest thing is you didn't give up.
Right.
Yep.
The second thing is that you did go talk to somebody, and working together with the people you talked to, they were able to get you the information that you needed, get the information in the format that you needed, but also they were able to educate the employees in Victorville and set them straight as to what is available and how it should be done. And so because of that, not only are you going to be getting your prescriptions the way you need them out of Victorville, but anybody else down there will as well. So that's actually a great example. And in the case of Kaiser, I think the important thing is, they do have phone numbers you can call. So definitely, if you have a problem, call the customer service line and ask, explain the situation. And again, if the person you first talked to isn't in a position to help because they're just the operator there and they don't have the authority to do certain things, then ask to be transferred to other people who can help out. And the other thing is, I'm assuming that Disability Rights Advocates still has an ongoing situation with the Kaiser settlement, right?
I think there's some.
Probably.
Yeah.
So you might actually want to call, if any of you are having issues with Kaiser accessibility, you might want to call Disability Rights Advocates and just see if there's somebody who's working on those accessibility issues from their end, and that you might get some help that way.
Well, I wonder if I didn't speak to Lisa. I vaguely remember talking to someone.
I don't think it was me.
No, you don't.
Lisa's not sure, but
Yeah.
But anyway, so I hope that helps.
Right.
And that was a good thing to bring up.
Because I didn't even know there was such a thing as a talking pill thing. So you talking
Yep.
Oh yes,
Yep.
yes.
Yep.
Now it's script talk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I want to bring up another scenario here, and this is, I want to know if any of you would like to share a situation where you were seeking an accommodation from a potential employer. Because remember, we said that they do have the responsibility to do some accommodations. Anybody want to jump in there and tell us something?
Yeah,
I had the experience, but it's an old one.
That's fine. We can run with it.
Back in 1973, I had gotten training for IRS, and I had gone through a temporary job, and now I was looking for a permanent one. And one thing I did is I told a travel agent what I wanted, and he gave me a list of all the hotels and so forth in all the districts of IRS for free. But I finally discovered that San Francisco and Brooklyn had openings. And I decided San Francisco is what I wanted to try first. And this guy named Mr. Gunderson was the person in personnel that I was supposed to talk to, and he kept putting me off and putting me off and putting me off. And my dad said, Mike, this is happening too long, you're going to have to get out there. And I said, I think you're right. And so I went out there and I showed up in Mr. Gunderson's office at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he wasn't there yet. And that's opening time for IRS. And the secretary made me comfortable, and she said, when he came in about 15 minutes later, she said, oh, Mr. Gunderson, you have someone waiting for you.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you know, it's a good thing you caught me today because I'm going to change jobs tomorrow.
Oh.
And so he went down with me to talk to the supervisor, and they interviewed me, and they said, you've got the job. But if I had tried to get in touch with him the next day, I'd have had to start all over again.
So sometimes it does mean being a little creative, you know. I mean, actually, that was good for you. That was great. Okay.
Hi, Frank, it's Miley.
Miley. Oh, Miley's got the phone. Then we'll come back.
Okay. This was a job with the State Health Exchange when that was. Those were jobs that were available like 5 years ago, and the test was not actually. I think I was able to take the initial test, but then I made that cut, and they actually gave me a rating, and I was like rated number 2. But then the next set of tests was not accessible. And by the time they got around to making the accommodations for me, they'd already made the cut and had already hired the number of people that they were allowed to hire in the Contra Costa office. And so I think I tried to talk to someone, but I just felt like I was banging my head against the wall, and I didn't really know where to go. So the second part of my question, if I did involve DRA or a lawyer or something like that, is that expense out of my pocket to do that?
I think it depends on the law firm. You know, I mean, the ones that I've been involved with, like in the case of like disability rights advocates and disability rights education fund, they tend to do like group things as opposed to specific individuals, and it tends to be something, at least in my experiences with them, where they did it in my behalf, but it wasn't they ended up billing the people that on the other side. And I think that's probably, they can justify that because it's not just one plaintiff really, it's a lot of people. There are probably individual lawyers where you'd actually have to retain them and hire a lawyer and pay them just like any other lawyer. So I guess it depends on the lawyer.
There'll be lawyers here this afternoon who can answer that.
Yes, so the ones they'll be able to tell you more about that.
I want to just bring up one thing regarding accommodations. Is it not a two-way street and often really a matter of negotiating some kind of a compromise? Because I've seen it where, let's say I want to do an accommodation or send someone an email or an electronic document, and they say, you know, look, I absolutely hate computers, I'm never ever gonna get one, and so that's not an accommodation, and I do need it on cassette. So is that, where does the law come down on this?
One word, reasonable. And a lot of times it does depend on the situation, because if you are dealing with a person who cannot use a computer, and then an electronic file is not going to be an appropriate accommodation. On the other hand, you know, given the status of cassette technology, I'm not sure that cassettes are still reasonable accommodations anymore. So it might be that their side of the story might be that they need to be open to using a CD instead of a cassette, you know, or being willing, or being willing to allow you to read them the information or something. So it's a negotiation, and it should be. And again, the big word is reasonable. So I think you're quite right about that. Of course, again, what's reasonable also depends on who you're dealing with on the other side. That if we're dealing with a big organization, then the accommodation that's reasonable to ask for from a big organization is probably a bit more than what's reasonable from a small organization or an individual. And in fact, in the case of businesses, I believe that if a really, really small organization may not even be covered, like if they only have fewer than 5 employees, they may not be covered by the law. I can't remember exactly, but... Somebody else with a question?
I actually had a couple comments, and I wanted to propose another scenario, one that I think everyone in this room has run into. The first comment is what I see in a lot of this conversation. There's a common thread running through here, and to me that is, in a lot of cases, people that you are interacting with, whatever business it might be, whatever organization, they're probably not used to dealing with people that are visually impaired on a daily basis. And some of what we need to do is this whole idea of just helping people feel initially comfortable with us, because they're just not used to conversing with us. I mean, I know at some level it sounds a little ridiculous, but if we see somebody come in that we might feel a little bit uncomfortable with, because in some way we think they're different on some level, we have to try the best we can to try to notch down that discomfort factor. Just a small example. I was looking for a barber shop about 4 years ago, because I get my hair cut really short, and I have a hell of a time with these female stylists that want to do all kinds of crap to it. Okay? That's right. I just want my hair cut in this military style, you know, cut. I don't want to mess around. So I walked into a barber shop about 4 years ago where I live in Hayward, and these guys were there, and they were playing hip-hop music and stuff. I walked in with a couple other visually impaired friends, and they were pretty uncomfortable with me and weren't really sure what to do, okay? So I told this guy what I wanted, how I wanted my haircut, and 4 years later, I go in there, they all know who I am, we talk about baseball, they're excited to see me every time, they walk me out to lift after, and okay, we're gonna see you again in a month, right? All right, you come back, you know. So, I mean, some of it really is just work on our part, trying to, and it doesn't always work, but in a lot of cases it's a comfort factor that we need to work on with people. Because once they understand that we're just folks too, just trying to get our business done, they get it and they actually care much more when they see you as an individual. And I think the scenario that I wanted to bring up was, how many of us have had this happen? The internet doesn't work and we need to call the cable company to try to deal with why it does not work.
How many lights are on?
And we have a modem.
Oh yeah.
Great. So I didn't know if one of you wanted to take that one on and be the phone representative from another country.
Hello, Comcast. How may I help you today?
Hi, sir. My name is Leah Gardner, and unfortunately, my internet is not working today. Could you help me resolve this?
Yes, we deal with this every day. We will be happy to help you. First of all, what is the message you are getting on your screen?
Well, I have to tell you, I'm visually impaired, and I can't read the screen.
Okay, is there any red print on the screen right now?
Sir, I'm totally blind, so it could be pink or gray or black on my screen, and I wouldn't know the difference.
Oh my, that's amazing. You people use computers too? That's wonderful.
Well, yes, we use them when the internet actually works. So how can we get about solving this problem?
Okay, let me look up in my database. No, actually, that's a very good suggestion.
Great. Aren't you going to ask me if I see the green light?
Looking that up, yes. Look on your modem.
And is there a neighbor to
That's
help
right.
me?
That's right.
Exactly, yes. But there are some things that you can do. First of all, and this is the good news, is that more and more of the telecommunication providers are having a disability support line. So I would definitely find out if your provider has one of those disability support lines and have that number handy in a format that you can read even if your phone isn't working, so that you can get some assistance if you find that scenario where the first line support person is just not properly trained. Usually that's the issue, is they haven't enough training, and so they don't trained. But I know how it is. So that's the first thing, is prepare ahead of time with whatever providers we have to make sure we have that disability service phone number, so that if we do a dead end with the person who we're talking to is happy. The other thing is that I get in that situation where I'm just finding that I'm kind of stuck with this customer support person, is that I will ask to speak to a supervisor. Because usually, one of the challenges is that the first line people only have so much that they're allowed to do. And if you take it up to the next level, then those folks may be able to bring more resources in to help maybe arrange to have something for you or something like that. So that would be my suggestion, is first of all that ask if you can talk to somebody higher up. And if you find that doesn't get you where you need to go, call that disability service number and take it from there. Right? We have a suggestion?
Yeah.
Good Comcast representative imitation.
I've had Comcast since I was now in it for quite some time, and I was given the number for disabled services. I call them first because they're more likely to know how to handle my situation.
Not a bad idea at all.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to throw out another scenario, and that one. Go ahead. Oh, I've got somebody calling for the floor. I used that.
Well, excuse me. My mic is Tamara.
Hi, Tamara.
I'm thinking about someday moving into a senior apartment.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I'm going to get it.
As far as my Comcast service, would I need to call the disability support line to have my services transferred, or would that be?
That would probably be the general customer service line for that kind of a thing. Just getting your service turned on at the new place, yeah.
How do I get the number?
I would just, if I didn't know a phone number, I would just call 411 and ask for the phone number for Comcast.
Yep.
If you have access to your bill, it's probably on there as well.
Well, I know the Comcast number, but I mean.
Yeah, so that's where you would start. You'd start with that main number, and because that's the kind of thing like that, transferring your service that they generally do for everybody, so they should be able to do that for you. Okay, here's another scenario that we probably all encountered.
Hold on.
Oh, we got one more. Okay.
Okay, talking about transferring your number, I don't know if you want to do that, because people here can tell you, I was without a phone for several weeks, trying to transfer my number.
Oh boy.
Between AT&T and Comcast. Comcast was not supposed to be getting my number. And then when I tried to get back to AT&T, they told me that I needed to talk to AT&T. AT&T said, no, you need to talk to Comcast. We're going back and forth. And then finally, I don't have a phone at all. My number is gone. It's dead. Well, we did a lot of things, and I'm not going into all of the stuff that we did, but we went to the top. We went to the president of AT&T.
Oh, wow.
We went to that office, and did we get action? Because Comcast had said to me, the last conversation, well, ma'am, you will not be getting your same number back because AT&T did not request your phone to be transferred back to them. So it was lost with the port or something. And your number is gone forever. I've had that number for umpteen years.
Yeah.
When we got in touch with the president's office, my daughter did this. I got my number back. I got a call from AT&T wanting to know if everything was taken care of, if I was satisfied. And I would have to say that even though we complain about AT&T, they are better. They really are. So I don't know if you want to change your number.
Right.
You better hold on to it.
Yep.
That's all I have to say.
But I'll tell you that's a great example, because you showed two things again. Be persistent, and if you need to, then don't be afraid to take it to the next level.
Yep.
Frank, this is David. And I just want to say that sometimes, and not always, there are some really good accessibility people, but sometimes I find that the accessibility numbers have been created as window dressing. And that's all they are, and the people there aren't trained. Or they're assigned to other jobs and they sort of answer the accessibility calls. And sometimes it's harder to deal with them than it is the general customer service. And what I find is that a lot of times the customer service people are very receptive if you give them solutions to things. And I think that's the key, to give some ideas, constructive approaches, and don't just gripe or complain, and don't never yell. And just be reasonable, and I think things can happen.
Excellent. Yes. Very well said. And sometimes we really are the experts, and it is okay for us to say, well, how about this solution? Did you know that we can that these things can be put into Braille, or
I actually want more hand up, so let me give it to him and then we can do the scenario.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Hello. Good afternoon. This is Claude Everett, or good morning.
Still morning. Still morning.
I have an observation, but also under the Air Carriers Act, are foreign carriers required to provide accommodations?
Foreign carriers?
Foreign carriers.
You know, you got me stumped on that one.
Okay.
My suspicion is that if they're providing service to, at least to U.S. airports, they probably do, but that's a good question. That's
Yeah, I just recently took a
excellent
trip to
question.
the Philippines and came back. My services going to the Philippines was very, very good. The return flight, I had some serious accommodation issues at the airport, but they finally resolved it. Philippines is extremely, what's the word I'm looking for? Not as accessible as they are here in the United States.
Right, and that's the case a lot of places.
Should be expected.
Yeah, true.
So, people here in the United States, we should be very thankful
Yeah.
to a certain extent.
I feel your pain there because this summer my wife and I got the privilege of going to England, and we had some interesting experiences at Heathrow Airport. So, and that's surprising because you wouldn't have think
Yeah.
England would be a
Wow.
problem, but it was.
Huh.
But anyway, so
Wow.
yes, it's that is true. When you go to different countries, things can be a bit different.
Huh.
So we have somebody with another scenario. I thought I heard Mike there.
You have one.
Frank, you said you had some.
I do, okay. Can somebody share an experience they had where you encountered an inaccessible website? Nobody in this room has had that, right?
Oh no. Oh no.
Oh boy, every
Okay.
hand up.
Lots of hands up?
Anybody hands up? Okay, I got one. Anybody hands up? Hello? Oh, okay.
Okay, hi, hey Frank, it's Christina.
Hey, Christina.
Hey, gee, I haven't talked to you in so long.
I know.
I have a Echo Dot, I won't say it because I think there's one in this room, but.
Yep, there is.
Gotta be careful with that. The Amazon.
Alexa, buy Frank a pizza.
That's it.
That's right. I don't know about that. That's what she said. Anyway,
actually
I go
could.
on, so there's an Amazon web portal, and it is often, and it's sometimes it's not accessible, and when I call customer service, there are certain things that you can only do control your device with the iPhone. And some people like me, we don't have iPhones, and the Amazon customer service people, most of their English is not so great, and they don't really get what I'm blind means, and that website is sometimes inaccessible.
I'd say, and here's what I would suggest there, is that and you might want to do this with a lot of the companies you deal with at times when you're not dealing with an emergency situation or a problem, is you might just call some of the companies that you deal with on a regular basis and call their customer service and ask if they have a specific disability service office.
Yeah, Amazon does. Yep,
Yeah,
they
I'm sure
do.
Amazon does.
Yep.
And so I would do that, and so then contact the Disability Service Department if they have one, and report the problem. Now, a lot of those things when you deal with website access, it's the kind of thing where they're not going to be able to fix it that day.
That's right.
But by people reporting it, it gets on their list of updates. And again, it's like I said earlier, the numbers thing, that if more of us would report these things, then those things are going to get higher in the queue as far as when they get worked on. So that's the way I would deal with that. But also, I would still call the customer service number, just because, again, what tends to happen in these customer services departments is that they do log calls. And again, as the different types of calls come in, that lets them know where they need to put their resources. So the more that we call in and report these things, even to the regular customer service, even if they're not in a position to help us today, it's still information that they can operate off of.
I have to tell an Amazon story.
Oh.
No, actually, this is good.
Okay.
My fiance, who's here, uses a Kindle. Now, I'm partially blind, so I don't use a screen reader.
Yeah.
And when they had an update, of course, it didn't talk.
Oh.
It wouldn't read the book. So, you know, I uninstalled it. I'm a technician, so I thought, well, maybe it's just a bad, you know. So we went back to the older one, it worked fine, and I put it, didn't want to update, did the update, same problem.
Yeah.
I did talk to a very nice lady at Amazon, explained it totally to her.
Yeah.
And she was very, very she listened very carefully, she didn't just, you know.
Yeah.
And she said she was gonna talk to, you know, the head technician and explain it, because I said, the files that make it talk are still in here. They're still in there, you know, I looked in, she told me to look, and I said, they're still there, they're just not working. And it took about 5 days or 6 days or so, but we kept going back and forth, and she did tell me that they figured it out and fixed it, never since then, it's not been a problem.
So they
So that's one good thing I can say, and she was a very good lady.
Very good. So and it was a matter of somebody probably just turned a switch off or something, or they did the software equivalent, and somebody just needed to fix the bug and where.
But it was so funny because
out
you
there,
know most people say, well, use the iPhone, and I said she doesn't want to use the iPhone. She uses her computer. You know?
Yeah.
Anyway, just had to tell that.
That's a great example.
No, Android people, Android person.
And I know Google has a disability department. So.
Yeah, well, that's hard to find though. The number's hard to find.
Any more questions? By the way, how are we doing on time? We're having fun here. Oh, good. We still have, it's 11:39. We still have time. Excellent. Let's get more questions.
So this is about employment.
Yes.
And I sometimes get to the problem where you want to have a conversation with someone about an accommodation, but they're getting so either off the top scared or off the top whatever they're anticipating, some kind of legal issue, that they give you these cliche answers that are not a real conversation. They just they will say, well, you know, they will tell you one thing and are very nice to you, and they act like they're listening to you, and then behind your back they go to your supervisor and tell your supervisor basically make this go away, okay? Or they will, I've also heard things like where they're saying, well, okay, fine, sue us. How do you deal with that?
You know, there is a point where that's exactly what you have to do. If people are going to be hard-nosed about it, then that's what you have to do. Unfortunately, you know, and frankly, I think that employment is one of the toughest areas in terms of discrimination because it's hard. You know, especially when you're seeking a job, because if you're seeking a job and there are 8 other people, then it may be obvious to you why you didn't get the job, but it's really easy for them just to say, well, so-and-so is the most qualified, and that's why we hired them, and what do you say?
It's just covered
You know,
now.
or if it's a situation where you're on the job and you're being messed around with by your employer, they'll try to say, well, you were a troublemaker, or you were a bad employee, or you were making mistakes. You know, so employment, I think, is one of the toughest areas in terms of discrimination, because frankly, unless the employers are stupid, they can get it. There are ways they can mask it. You know, but having said that, though, you know, do remember that we do have accommodation rights, and that you know there are organizations out there that can help you if you want to pursue issues. I now and then I get somebody has put me on a list to send me updates from the Justice Department's Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or whatever. So I get, and I get these reports about, what they've been working on in the last quarter or something. And so there's always usually some employment case. So there are entities that do work on employment discrimination, and it may be that when you're in that situation, if you're in a place where it is a hostile employment situation, an employer who's not willing to accommodate, that is where you will need to get professional assistance to advocate for your situation.
And I would recommend documenting everything. Hopefully, you know, your HR department knows a thing or two and will back you up in terms of accommodations. But regardless of what the scenario is, it's good to document everything.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Big time. I think that's probably one of the most important areas where documentation is important, is when you get into those employment situations. Again, because they can be tough, and so you really have to have evidence, you know, where you really do, you know, like write down, you know, I spoke with so-and-so on thus and such a date, and this was what happened, and then 2 days later, this is what happened, and have the whole timeline where you can present it to somebody and say, this is what's going on, here's the documentation, and they can work with that.
This is Preston Moses.
Hey, Preston.
Yes, I had an issue before ADA ever happened, and this is a question of passport situation where the person wouldn't read, she'd answer any questions I wanted to know about but in terms of helping me fill it out and reading, she wouldn't do it. Turned out a cab driver friend of mine helped me, and I went to the travel agent and I told him exactly what happened at this particular passport office and about what happened, and she says, good, we won't use them again. Meaning that particular passport service. Now, what covers that kind of a situation? Does the same thing here apply about whether or not they could get in trouble if they, like you were talking about earlier, or what applies in the passport situation as far as if they're not willing to help you? I wasn't sure quite.
Okay, now part of that, of course, is because it was before the ADA, so there was a lot more stuff people could get away with back then. It also depends if it's a government office or if it's a private business, because if it's a government office, then it's very clear that accommodation is required. And you know, there are usually things in place that you can contact in terms of complaint offices. The other thing is when you have an issue with the government, there's always the option of contacting your legislator's local office and saying, I'm having a problem with the passport office, or I'm having a problem with the Social Security Administration, or because they've got people, and that's most of what they do in their local office is deal with what they call constituent services, which is basically helping people cut through government red tape or whatever nonsense is going on. So that's another thing to keep in your toolkit, is the phone number for your local legislator's office. And remember that you want to make sure that if it's a state office, that you go to your state legislator, and if it's a federal office, you go to your federal legislature, because, you know, if I'm having a problem with Social Security Department, there's no sense in me calling my local state assembly member, because that's not their deal, right? But I want to call Congresswoman Lee's office here in my, I happen to be in Congresswoman Lee's district here, okay, in Alameda County. And that's always an option there.
How do you find those people and their number?
That's, again, I would start by calling 411, because they have local offices, and so if you just call your local 411 and ask for and if they ask for, is it business or government, ask for government, and then ask for the office, you know, the local office, the district office for your member of Congress.
I don't know, but I suspect that if you have a smartphone with a talking feature like Siri, or what does Android have?
Google Now.
Yeah, and you just ask, like, what is my local congressman's office number? They might actually be able to give it to you, or at least the name of the congressperson, or Google it if you are comfortable using your computer. Yeah, so there's definitely websites out there that help match you to your congressional districts and your state legislators.
I want to add something.
Yeah.
But remember that if you're not a technical person and you're not into that stuff, keep on hand the number of your public library, because they still have reference desks.
Oh yeah,
So,
that's right.
if you want information, you're not going to do the computer cell phone thing. Keep a card with that public library phone number on it. Just ask for the reference desk. That's what the reference librarians like to do, is get information. So there you go. And of course, 411. And by the way, another thing is, of course, have you all heard of 211?
Yep.
Here's another good one. If you want information about referrals for services, is that a lot of counties have a number that's called 211. And it's specifically for getting information, referral type questions answered. So keep that in mind, that's always a great resource to keep handy.
Oh, I have a comment about.
Hi Frank, it's Jean.
Hi Jean.
Yeah, I got that too. What I want to know is in 2005, September 29th, 2005, I was wrongfully terminated from a nonprofit. And they accused me of a heinous crime because they figured they couldn't do an ADA issue. And so what happened was that I documented everything. And I finally had to get an attorney because I just was not allowed them to defame my profession or my being. I just was never going to allow that to happen. However, I did get treatment. But I think what I was having a problem is getting the attorney first was happening, even though I had documentation. And also, when I went to the EEOC to file the complaint, they were getting ready to close it until the attorney, because I was accused of sexual harassment, and they wanted, for finally, because they were going to close it, my attorney stated, in fact, before you close that case, I wanted to post every client that you have accused her of doing such things to them. So I went to the meeting, and the organization decided to conciliate just because they didn't have sufficient proof or documentation that I had done all these things. However, what it did do, though, is I won my case. Yes, I felt empowered. Yes, I had the means to pay because I was going to get some money. But my question is, if you're caught into a situation where you're really compelled to find somebody, but you can't find anybody unless you get an attorney, but you don't have the means for an attorney, what's the option? What's the mentorship issue? I mean, I'm confused.
That's an important issue because there are a lot of people who don't have big bucks to pay an attorney, but they have needs. And I would say in that situation that I would start with your county bar association and ask them for referrals to attorneys pro bono attorneys or legal aid groups, and follow those leads.
There'll be lawyers here later this afternoon. They probably can answer that.
Yeah, the folks this afternoon may be able to give you some more specific responses to that situation, but because that's an important one. But again, I want to point out something too, is that you gave us another example that you were persistent and you documented, and because of that, you were able to stand up in that situation.
We have time. Do you want to talk about discrimination in a business?
Yeah.
Kind of.
On mic, it's Tam again.
It's Frank. Go ahead.
Okay. My sister is 1 year and 3 months older than I am. And she's sighted. And she had been for quite a while looking for employment. Well, the excuse has been for her that nobody wants to hire her because of her age and because she's sighted. Of course, that shouldn't be the excuse for us. Is that correct?
Well, age discrimination is also illegal. So if there are employers that are actually stupid enough to say that to her, then they're basically a lawsuit waiting to happen.
Yep.
Because no, it is age discrimination is real, just as disability discrimination is real, and it's just as illegal.
Yep.
I want to throw out one last scenario, and that is, would any of you like to share an experience where you had to respond to discrimination, a disability discrimination by a local business? Were you maybe an encounter where you were discriminated against by a local business?
I have an example.
Hi, this is Claude Everett. Back in 1998, my partner and I were discriminated by Friendly Cab in regards to guide dog service, guide dog accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
We had to go through Reddit, through not structured negotiation, but through
mediation.
Mediation. Finally got it resolved, and there was 5 years that they had to take care of issues in regards to posting their requirements of what they were supposed to do and what the drivers were supposed to do. But they still, to a certain, some cab drivers still walk that edge, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. That is very true. And this is something where it's challenging, especially for those of us who are blind, because a lot of times it's a situation where the ideal thing you'd like to do is get get something like a license number, the car license number, or if they've got some kind of a serial number on their cab, that you'd like to be able to get that. Now, in some cities, they actually will require the cabs to put in Braille on the passenger door a plaque that gives that information, so you could take it down.
Yep.
Oh, wow.
And that's helpful. It doesn't happen. A lot of places don't do that, but that's something that's helpful. And again, I think that's where if it is part of a company, the company, you could call the company and report it. And another thing that you can do is if you call your city and find out who, if anybody, has jurisdiction over taxis in the city, because they're, unfortunately, for example, I'm in San Leandro, and they sort of take a hands-off approach to taxis, where, on the other hand, I work in San Francisco, where they have a very robust taxi commission. Mm-hmm. So it varies, and that's something you can put in your toolbox, is finding out who has authority over any licensing of taxis in your community. If you have that number handy, then if something comes up, you can report it to them, and they can push back on the company. And again, if the legal route is always another option.
Any other hands up?
I think Lisa Maria has something.
I just also wanted to point out that some of the discrimination we face in businesses can seem, it doesn't always have to be something really egregious like, cab companies denying us, but it could seem really silly to us. And when it is something that we're like, oh my God, really? We just have to remember to be really polite and firm. And the example I'm thinking of, years ago, I was a camp counselor for a camp with a bunch of blind youth way up in Northern California by Quincy. And there was about 10 blind youth, teenagers, and a whole bunch of blind counselor staff. And we took the students to I think it was a wildlife museum. And they had a lot of cool hands-on stuffed animals and whatnot. Well, animals that were stuffed, not like teddy bear stuff, that we could touch and learn about. And we come out of the van, and they come running out of the building, and they said, "You can't come in here." Oh. And the kids were great. They handled it. They handled everything. And they said, "Of course we could come in here." They're like, "No, you're blind. You can't come in here." And the kids were like, "Why can't we come in? What does our blindness have to do with it?" There are 3 steps going up into the door.
Oh, wow.
And the students were like, "Well, that's okay." "No, you could trip and fall." And they said, "That's why we have these canes." And one of the kids just walked up the stairs and walked through the door, and then the rest followed. And the museum staff just stood there with their jaws on the floor like, whoa. Yep. And then after that, once we were inside, they were really great. But sometimes, you know, it's the little tiny things like that that seem kind of funny, but it's an education to the people we're dealing with.
That is that's a great one to end on. Sometimes it is just about just getting out there and doing it and letting them get out of the way.
Yep.
Well, we're getting the hook here. This has been a lot of fun. And great participation. So just know that you have a right to be part of society, that you, as long as you're being reasonable, you have rights to accommodation, and that there are people out there who are willing to help. So I think it's time for lunch, and thanks again for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.